My name is Marcus, and every year, when fall came around, I loved taking long drives through the countryside. The sight of leaves turning orange, red, and gold always put me at ease. There was something about the crisp air and the quiet beauty of the season that felt peaceful. But last October, my fall drive turned into something I'll never forget. It all started one evening when I decided to take a detour off the main road. I'd driven through this area before, but I wanted to explore some of the back roads that I'd never been down. My GPS wasn't picking up a signal, but I wasn't worried. I liked getting a little lost and finding new places. Besides, I could always backtrack if I needed to. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the fields and trees. The air smelled like wood smoke and dry leaves. I rolled down the windows, letting the cool breeze flow through the car. It was perfect. That's when I saw a small winding road up ahead. There was no sign, and the road looked old, barely wide enough for one car. It was surrounded by thick trees that created a tunnel of branches overhead, the kind that would be beautiful in the daylight but eerie as night fell. Something about the road called to me, so I turned onto it. As soon as I did, the feeling in the air changed. The temperature seemed to drop, and a thick fog started to roll in from the trees. I turned on my headlights, but the fog was so dense that I could barely see a few feet in front of me. The road twisted and turned, and I had to slow down to avoid veering off into the trees. I told myself it was just the weather. Fall was unpredictable like that, especially in rural areas. But as I drove deeper into the fog, a sense of unease began to settle in my stomach. The road felt endless, winding through the woods without any sign of houses, lights, or other cars. It was as if I had driven into another world entirely. I tried to shake off the feeling and kept driving. The sun had fully set by now, and the only light came from my dim headlights cutting through the thick mist. I couldn't even tell how far I had gone, but it felt like I had been driving for hours. The road seemed to go on forever, with no sign of an end. That's when I noticed something strange. Through the fog, I saw a figure standing by the side of the road. It was hard to make out in the mist, but it looked like a person, standing completely still. I slowed down as I approached, thinking maybe they needed help. But as I got closer, the figure vanished into the fog, like it had never been there. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing. I sat there for a moment, trying to convince myself that my eyes were playing tricks on me. The fog, the shadows, maybe it was all just a weird optical illusion. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I thought about turning around, but the road was too narrow. There was no way to make a U-turn without risking getting stuck in the ditch. My only option was to keep moving forward, hoping that I would find my way out soon. As I drove on, the fog seemed to thicken even more, making it harder to see. The trees on either side of the road loomed over me like dark, twisted figures, their branches scraping against the sides of the car as I passed. The road itself seemed to be narrowing, and I had to grip the steering wheel tightly to stay on course. Then, up ahead, I saw it again, the figure. This time, it was closer to the middle of the road, standing perfectly still, shrouded in mist. I slowed down again, squinting through the fog to get a better look. It was definitely a person, but I couldn't make out any details. They were wearing dark clothing, and their face was obscured by the fog. I rolled down the window a crack, hoping to call out and ask if they needed help. But before I could say anything, the figure stepped back into the fog and disappeared, just like before. My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew I had to get out of there. I pressed down on the gas, picking up speed as I drove through the mist. The road twisted and turned, and I could feel the tension building in my body as I searched for any sign of an exit. But no matter how far I drove, the road just kept going. Then, out of nowhere, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, in the middle of the road, was an old wooden sign. It was weathered and covered in moss, but I could just make out the words, Blackwood Road. I frowned. That didn't make sense. I hadn't seen any sign when I first turned onto the road, and I had never heard of Blackwood Road before. It wasn't on any map I had seen, and I had no idea where it led. As I drove past the sign, I felt a chill run down my spine. The air in the car seemed to grow colder, and the fog pressed in even tighter around me. My headlights flickered for a moment, then steadied, but the road ahead seemed darker now, as if the fog was swallowing up the light. That's when I saw the figure again. This time, it was standing right in the middle of the road, blocking my path. I hit the brakes hard, my car skidding to a stop just a few feet away from them. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me through the fog. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel its eyes on me. My heart was racing, and my hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't go forward, and there was no way to turn around. I rolled down the window slightly, my voice trembling as I called out, "Hey, do you need help?" There was no response. I swallowed hard, my pulse pounding in my ears. Something was very wrong. Every instinct in my body was telling me to get out of there, to leave, but I was trapped. The fog was so thick that I couldn't even see the trees anymore. It was like the road was the only thing left in the world. Suddenly, the figure began to move. Slowly, it started walking toward the car. Its movements were stiff, unnatural, as if it was being pulled forward by some invisible force. My heart raced as it got closer, and I slammed the car into reverse, backing up as fast as I could. But the figure kept coming. I could barely breathe as I reversed down the narrow road, my headlights flickering in the mist. The figure was still coming, its dark form looming closer and closer, no matter how fast I tried to escape. I turned the wheel sharply, trying to avoid a collision, but the road was too narrow. My car veered off to the side, the tires slipping into the ditch with a sickening thud. I was stuck. Panic surged through me as I tried to rev the engine, but the tires just spun in the mud. I was trapped, and the figure was still coming. It was only a few feet away now, its shadowy form almost close enough to touch. I grabbed my phone, desperate to call for help, but there was no signal. I was completely cut off, alone in the fog with whatever was out there. The figure stopped just a few feet from the car. It stood there for a moment, its face still hidden in the mist. Then, slowly, it raised its hand and pointed at me. I felt a wave of cold wash over me, so intense that it felt like my blood had turned to ice. The figure didn't speak, but I could feel its presence pressing down on me, suffocating me. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen in fear, but eventually, the figure lowered its hand and turned away. It walked back into the fog, disappearing into the mist as if it had never been there at all. For a long time, I just sat in the car, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't dare move, didn't dare get out. Eventually, the fog began to lift, and the road ahead slowly came into view. I managed to get the car out of the ditch and back onto the road. I didn't look back. I just drove, faster than I ever had before, until I finally found my way back to the main road. I never spoke about what happened that night. I don't know what I saw, and I don't want to know. All I know is that I'll never drive down Blackwood Road again. And if you ever find yourself driving through the countryside in the fall, be careful. Some roads lead to places you can't come back from. Fall had just begun, and the small town of Redwood was buzzing with excitement. The air was crisp, the leaves had turned shades of orange and red, and everyone was preparing for the town's annual fall festival. My name is Peter, and I had just moved to this town for a fresh start. After a difficult year, I thought a quiet town surrounded by forests would be the perfect place to clear my head. But I was wrong. The first week in Redwood was peaceful. I spent my days unpacking boxes, walking through the forest trails, and getting to know the locals. Everyone seemed friendly enough, and the town itself felt warm and welcoming. There was something magical about the way the leaves crunched underfoot, and the smell of cinnamon and apples filled the air. One afternoon, while taking my usual walk through the woods, I noticed something strange. The forest, normally alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves, had gone silent. I stopped for a moment, listening closely, but all I could hear was the wind. As I was about to turn back toward home, I heard a whisper. It was faint, almost like the wind, but it was unmistakable. "Peter." I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked around, but there was no one there. The trees stood tall and still, their branches swaying slightly in the breeze. I shook my head, convincing myself I must have imagined it, and hurried back to my house. But the feeling of being watched lingered long after I locked the door behind me. The next few days, things got stranger. Every time I went for a walk, I heard the whisper, "Peter, come closer." It seemed to come from the trees, from the very leaves themselves. I tried to ignore it, but the more I tried, the louder it became. One night, as I was sitting by the fireplace, The whisper echoed through my head again. This time, it didn't sound like the wind. It sounded human, almost pleading. "Come to the woods, Pete." I couldn't sleep that night. The whisper haunted me, growing louder and more urgent with every passing minute. By the time dawn broke, I had made up my mind. I had to find out what was calling me from the woods. Maybe it was just my imagination, maybe I was going crazy, but I had to know. I grabbed a flashlight and set out for the forest. The air was colder than usual, and the sky was covered in thick gray clouds. The leaves crunched beneath my boots as I walked deeper into the woods, following the whisper. "Peter, this way." The deeper I went, the more uneasy I felt. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches twisting like skeletal hands. The once beautiful fall colors looked dull and lifeless in the dim light. The whisper grew louder, guiding me to a clearing I had never seen before. In the center of the clearing stood an old, gnarled tree, its bark blackened and twisted. At its base was a pile of leaves, arranged in a perfect circle. As I approached, the whisper became deafening, as if it was coming from the tree itself. "Peter, come closer." My body moved on its own, stepping closer to the tree. The air around me felt thick, heavy, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the bark. The moment my fingers made contact, the ground beneath me shook. The pile of leaves began to stir, shifting and swirling as if something was moving beneath. I stumbled back, my heart racing. The leaves rose into the air, swirling faster and faster until they formed a figure. It was tall, cloaked in leaves, with hollow eyes that glowed a faint orange. The whisper was no longer faint, it was a scream. "You shouldn't have come here, Peter." The figure stepped toward me, its voice echoing through the trees. "We've been waiting for you." I turned and ran, the sound of crunching leaves and rustling branches chasing after me. The woods seemed to stretch on forever, the trees twisting and turning as I tried to find my way out. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. "Don't leave. Don't run." By the time I burst out of the woods and into my yard, I was gasping for breath. The whispers had stopped, but the feeling of dread lingered. I slammed the door behind me, locking it tight, and collapsed on the floor. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure made of leaves, its hollow eyes staring at me. I stayed awake, watching the trees outside my window, waiting for something to appear. But nothing came. The next morning, I packed my bags and left Redwood. I never looked back, and I never told anyone what I had seen in the woods. But sometimes, when the wind blows just right and the leaves rustle outside my window, I swear I can still hear the whisper. "Peter, come back." Fall was my favorite time of the year. The air was cool and crisp, and the trees turned vibrant shades of orange, yellow, and red. My name is Mark, and I had just moved to a small town called Hollow Creek. After living in the city my whole life, I was ready for a change. The town was quiet, surrounded by dense forests, and it felt like the perfect place to settle down. The town itself was small, with only a few hundred residents. Everyone knew each other, and it didn't take long for me to meet the locals. They were friendly, always waving as I passed by, but there was something strange about Hollow Creek. Every time I mentioned going for a walk in the woods, people would quickly change the subject or give me a nervous smile. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe they just weren't outdoorsy people. My house was a little cottage at the edge of the forest. It was old, with creaky floors and an overgrown garden, but it had charm. I spent the first few weeks fixing it up, painting the walls and clearing out the yard. Every day, I would hear the wind blowing through the trees, making the leaves rustle like they were whispering to each other. One evening, I decided to take a walk through the woods. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the ground, and the leaves crunched under my boots as I made my way down the narrow path. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet. There were no birds singing, no rustling of animals in the bushes, just the sound of the wind. As I walked deeper into the woods, I noticed something strange. The trees seemed to get closer together, their branches twisting in odd shapes, almost like they were reaching out to grab me. The air grew colder, and the once welcoming forest began to feel oppressive. I should have turned back, but something kept pulling me forward. I wanted to see what was deeper in the woods, to explore the forest that had been calling to me since I arrived in Hollow Creek. As I walked, I began to notice small carvings on the trees. They were strange symbols, crudely etched into the bark. I couldn't make out what they meant, but they gave me an uneasy feeling. Then I heard it, a soft whisper, carried by the wind. "Mark." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there. I looked around, but there was no one in sight. The trees stood tall and silent, their branches swaying slightly in the breeze. I tried to shake off the feeling, convincing myself it was just the wind playing tricks on me, and continued down the path. The farther I went, the more uneasy I felt. The trees seemed to close in around me, and the whisper grew louder. "Mark, come closer." I stopped again, my breath catching in my throat. This time the whisper was clearer, more distinct. It wasn't just the wind, it was a voice, but there was no one there. I turned around, ready to head back to my house, but the path behind me looked different. The trees seemed thicker, the trail narrower. I couldn't tell if I had walked that far, or if the forest itself had changed. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Mark, don't leave." I quickened my pace, trying to get back to the cottage as fast as I could, but no matter how far I walked, the trees didn't thin out. The path didn't lead me back to my yard. It felt like I was going in circles, the forest twisting and turning around me. That's when I saw it. In the distance, through the dense trees, I saw a figure. It was standing perfectly still, watching me. At first, I thought it was a person, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't human. It was tall, much taller than anyone I had ever seen, and its body was made of branches and leaves. Its face was a hollow, dark space, with no eyes or mouth, just a void. The whisper returned, now right in my ear. "Mark, you shouldn't have come here." I turned and ran, not caring where I was going, as long as it was away from that thing. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, the trees twisting and turning, blocking any way out. No matter how fast I ran, I could feel the figure's presence behind me, like it was following, watching. Finally, I stumbled out of the forest and onto the main road near my house. I collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for air. The forest behind me was silent once again, as if nothing had happened. The figure was gone, and the whispers had stopped. I made my way back to my house, my hands shaking as I locked the door behind me. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the hollow face of the figure, its dark void staring back at me. I stayed awake, listening to the wind howling outside, waiting for the whisper to return. The next day, I went into town, determined to find out what was going on. I asked some of the locals about the forest, about the carvings on the trees and the figure I had seen. But every time I brought it up, they would just shake their heads and tell me to stay out of the woods. Finally, an old man at the local diner pulled me aside. His face was lined with age, and his eyes were filled with a quiet sadness. "You shouldn't have gone into the forest," he said, his voice low. "There are things in there that don't belong in this world." I asked him what he meant, and he told me the story of the Hollow Wind. Long ago, the people of Hollow Creek had angered something in the woods. No one knew exactly what it was, but it was ancient, powerful, and it had cursed the town. Every fall, when the wind blew through the trees, it would whisper to anyone who ventured too deep into the forest, calling them closer, drawing them in. "They never come back," the old man said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Once the forest has you, it doesn't let go." I left the diner that day feeling more uneasy than ever. The wind had picked up again, rustling the leaves, and I could have sworn I heard my name carried on the breeze. I spent the next few days avoiding the woods, keeping to the main roads and staying close to town. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to return to the forest. One night, I was sitting by the window, staring out at the dark trees in the distance. The wind was howling, louder than I had ever heard it before. As I watched, the trees began to sway, their branches twisting and writhing like they were alive. And then I heard it again, the whisper, "Mark, come back." My heart raced as I backed away from the window, but the whisper grew louder, more insistent. "Mark, don't run." I grabbed my coat and headed for the door, but before I could leave, the lights in the house flickered and went out. I stood frozen in the dark, listening to the wind as it howled outside. and then the door slowly creaked open. Standing in the doorway was the figure. It was taller than I remembered, its hollow face staring down at me. The air in the room grew colder, and the whisper filled my head, drowning out everything else. "Mark, you belong to the forest now." I turned and ran, but no matter how fast I moved, the whisper followed me, growing louder and louder until it was all I could hear. I stumbled through the dark, out into the yard and down the road. The wind whipped around me, carrying the leaves in a swirling frenzy. The trees seemed to close in, the forest stretching its branches out toward me. I didn't stop running until I reached the edge of town, where the lights of the diner flickered in the distance. I burst through the door, gasping for breath, and collapsed onto the floor. The old man was there, watching me with sad eyes. He shook his head, his voice barely audible over the sound of the wind outside. "It's too late, Mark," he whispered. "Once the forest calls your name, there's no escaping it." And as I sat there, the whisper filled the room once more. "Mark, come back.